We're with Ed Miliband, now with one of the most significant jobs in the cabinet.
So many people in our country are deeply unhappy with the way this country is run. There is a progressive story to be told about this government. We need to tell it more.
Ed and I were both there kind of around the start of New Labour. The TBGBs really did become much more about personalities and ambition. We were both members of the so-called group of death.
It was an extraordinary political apprenticeship working for Gordon.
And what it revealed is that without Tony Blair in the room, you were all a bunch of lefties.
More lefty, yeah, including him.
People think you're just not tough enough.
Well, let me tell you, hell yes, I'm tough enough. I don't think I lost the election to the sandwich. I think the defeat was really painful, but my issue was more, well, what the hell do I do now?
The key question you have to ask yourself is not what are you doing in this job, but what's next? What comes after that job?
I think a lot of people found it difficult to understand how you ended up challenging David for the leadership.
We challenged each other, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
The two of us standing against each other, created massive tension and issues. Look, for the hardest decision I've ever made, I felt I owed it to myself to say, look, this is what you believe. Intellect and ideas really matter in politics. You can't just do this because you want to be leader of the Labour Party. Do you have something distinctive to say about the Labour Party and about the country? And I felt I did have something distinctive to say, and that's why I ran.
Did you think when you got the job as the leader of the Labour Party, did you think, I am going to win the next election? This episode is brought to you by Revolut Business, the all-in-one account designed for efficiency and built for business.
Is it true, basically, that you don't even have a spreadsheet to do your expenses?
I've got a pen, paper clips, little notes, but I accept it could be more efficient, Rory.
So I'm going to sell Revolut Business to you. Brings clarity and efficiency, works in over 30 different currencies, no hidden fees, smart spending tools. It is actually pretty amazing.
And you can set card limits, you can automate your expenses. Basically, it does take the stress out of your financial woes. There's also a £200 welcome bonus if you're new to Revolut Business.
So just open a Revolut Business account today by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the episode description. Add money to your account by July the 7th, 2025 and get a £200 welcome bonus. Feature availability varies by plan. Fees and T's and C's apply.
Whatever stage your business is at.
With Revolut Business, you're ready for what's next. Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. And we're with Ed Miliband. And I'm delighted to say we're going to be with Ed Miliband for some time. We're going to do two parts. And the first part essentially will be his life growing up in a very, very political family, then his career through politics, his relationship with his brother, which became somewhat Shakespearean at a certain point in their lives, when they both fought for the leadership of the Labour Party, his experience as a cabinet minister and then as leader of the Labour Party. And that's going to be the first part. And then the second part, how he recovered from defeat, his decision to stay in politics, and now with one of the most significant jobs in the cabinet, under Keir Starmer as Secretary of State for Climate, Energy Security and Net Zero. So there's an awful lot to talk about. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Well done on your podcast.
Well, you used to present the UK's number one political podcast.
I used to be a podcaster,
while.
And Alastair used to say to Fiona, why does Ed go on about his effing podcast all the time?
Can I get to the bottom of Alastair saying he's known you for a long time? Because we have this kind of vision of you with Tony Benn helping you with your homework and all these sort of grand figures knowing you when you were a child. He didn't know you when you were that young, right?
No.
But Ed and I were both there together kind of around the start of New Labour. Ed very much identified as Gordon's man and me very much as Tony's man. But Ed, we'll come on to that. Let's start, though, with your childhood. You've got two very, very, very interesting parents. So just tell us a little bit about them, their background, and the influence they had you and David.
Yeah, so both my parents were Jewish refugees. My dad, born in Belgium, left in 19 40 with his father just before the Nazis arrived, walked from Brussels to Ostend and took a boat to Britain.
And how old was he then?
16. So he was born in 1924. My mum, Jewish refugee from Poland who was in hiding in Poland during the war, after the war, lost her father in a concentration camp. It's such a defining part of who I think both David and I are, and it's such an extraordinary life that an upbringing that they had, and such a dislocated and traumatic time. We didn't talk about it much growing up. It's got so many different implications. The trauma, I think also the belief in human goodness, because my mother only survived the war because of a lady who took in my grandma, my mum, and my aunt.
In England?
In Warsaw. It was really this family, the Sitkowski family, and the son, who, as he then was, who was sort of 14, 15 at the time and was part of the resistance, just very recently died. And he was an amazing guy who I met. And again, I took my family to meet him. But it was the heroism of people like that meant that my mum survived the war.
Ed, your father came then to Britain when he was 16.
Yeah.
What did that mean in terms of his relationship to Britain? Did he speak completely fluent English straight from before he was 16? Did he learn it when he was there?
I think he learnt it really when he came. I think he must have had some English, but he learnt it when he came. He arrived as Adolf. His mother, in her infinite lack of wisdom, decided to call him Adolf in 1924. And his landlady in Britain said, "You can't be called Adolf. You're going to have to change your name to Ralph." So he was from then on Ralph. He went to night school. He learnt English. He then joined the Royal Navy and was actually at the Normandy landings. He was what they call the chief petty officer. So he was the person trying to translate the German communication.
And he spoke French and German.
I think
as
he
well?
must have spoken German, so that's how he was able to do that. Yeah. I think he always had an incredible sort of gratitude, I think, for the fact that Britain took him in, and eventually and his father, and then he obviously settled here. And he always talked very glowingly about his time in the Royal Navy and the sort of camaraderie of it and sort of what it meant.
The other Rory in my life says that my finest moment on television was when I went out to attack the Daily Mail after they called your dad the man who hated Britain.
I know.
What was that all like when your dad was a Marxist, and he became one of the leading kind of Marxist intellectuals. I remember David, your brother, telling me the story about how he used to go and sort of salute Karl Marx's grave in Highgate Cemetery. Did he ever take you along?
Not salute.
Well, salute as in pay tribute.
He didn't like the grave, actually. He thought he thought it was awful, actually.
Too big?
Too sort of garish and horrible. Yeah, it wasn't his thing. I mean, he is himself buried in Highgate Cemetery, but it wasn't, it wasn't his thing, really.
But when you were growing up, and as Rory said, you grew up in a very political household. Joe Slovo from the anti-apartheid movement was popping in, and Tony Benn. Did you always have a sense of politics being the most important thing in life?
Yeah. I think politics is almost too narrow a way of putting it. I think, look, for them, you hear a lot from people today, politics doesn't make any difference. For them, it made, it turned their life upside down. It killed my mother's father, my grandfather. It killed many members of my dad and mum's family. So I think that really what happened was that they felt lucky and sort of blessed that they had survived. And I think that then gave them a sense of, you have a duty to try and make the world a better place, to use the time you've got to try and make the world a better place. So I think it wasn't sort of Das Kapital for breakfast, but it was more sort of
lunch.
It was, it was just more a sense of a sort of responsibility to the world, and also their community was these extraordinary people. About You mentioned Ruth First and Joe Slovo. Ruth First was an anti-apartheid activist who was killed by the South African government. I met her just some months before she was killed. She was killed in a letter bomb sent to Mozambique. And, this was their community of people. And so it was sort of infused in the bloodstream in a way.
Ed, I think just to sort of put on the record, clearly your politics is very different from your father's. And your father was somebody who had a deep affection for Britain and, as you say, served in the Royal Navy. But I wonder whether it's possible to step back from that mad sort of slander in the Daily Mail to you reflecting a little bit on his politics rather than yours.
Yeah.
And what that was like for him coming out of the Second World War, because he clearly, and it's a theme we keep returning to in the podcast, some people came out of the end of the Second World War, particularly kind of liberal Americans, thinking that the solution was liberal democracy, capitalism, rules-based international order, and all the stuff that we talked about from 1989 onwards. Your father drew a different conclusion from his experience of the war and what he thought a just society could be. Can we focus on that while absolutely accepting that's not your politics, but I'd be interested in how he saw the world?
I think it's interesting because it's complicated because sort of Marxist in a way, for him, Marxism was an analysis of society rather than a prescription. It was an analysis of society based on class and class division. He used to describe it as a tool to think about society. And if you think about sort of communism as it was practiced, he was very skeptical about it. He was never a member of the Communist Party. But his vision was a sort of, vision based on large-scale public ownership, a much more egalitarian society. And so it was in a sort of Marxist tradition, but it's, he was a member of the Labour Party at one point. Ian Mikado, some people listeners will know, a big figure in the Labour Party. He was very close to him, I think in the 50s. And then he got fed up with the Labour Party and, so yearned for a very different society. And he tried to give expression to that. And I suppose, again, for contemporary listeners, you and your brother David are very much associated with New Labour, which for some people on the Tony Benn side of the Labour Party was quite a kind of radical departure. Did you feel a sort of tension or an issue in departing from your father's vision of politics towards a sort of more social democratic vision of politics? Yes. I think that the sort of distinction I would draw, and this was a distinction that he was quite open to, I think, which is, the pragmatic practice of what you can actually achieve in your own generation, in your own lifetime, in the actually existing messy world of politics versus more utopian visions of what the good society might look like. And I'm not saying, well, he was a supporter of New Labour. I mean, he died shortly, he died sort of around the time that John Smith died. So he didn't see New Labour, but he wouldn't have been a supporter of New Labour. But he wasn't one of these people who thought, well, I'll just have my utopian visions and I'm not going to knock on doors for the Labour Party. I don't care what happens in a general election. I remember him being incredibly depressed when the Tories won in 1992, which was the last general election he saw. So definitely there's a sort of parting of ways in some senses, but he was very tolerant of people who were trying in the difficulties of actually existing politics to try and sort of bend the curve of what happened.
He was quite old when you were born, wasn't he? He was well into his 40s.
Yeah. It's hard having old parents.
And you were 24 when he died.
Yeah.
And so he's long passed, and and now your mother's Marion's still with us, but she's not well. We all know people with Alzheimer's, but when you're sort of living the life that you're living, and David spends a lot of time in the States, just tell us a little bit about what that's like and how you've dealt with that.
I mean, look, I think my dad's death was an unbelievably traumatic experience for me. I don't think I realised it at the time that 24 was young for him to die, but it felt like He'd had this heart attack in the early 1970s, which obviously when I was really, really young, wasn't really aware of. And, I always had a sense, I suppose, in the back of my mind of his mortality. I think he did too. And then he had this heart bypass in 1991, which he nearly died a number of times afterwards, and it was all but it was a sort of, it's like the worst thing that's happened to me in my life, and it's like 30 years ago, so it feels like such a long time ago. But he was such a kind of lodestar, such a sort of presence. It's just unbelievably hard. Look, my mum is still alive. She's 90. She's unfortunately got very bad Alzheimer's. I still see her a lot. She lives nearby. It's really hard. I'm really grateful for every day with her, though. It's interesting. My experience of her Alzheimer's is incredibly sad. But even beneath it all, she's still got some of her old personality, which I really value. I was just talking to Justine about this at the weekend, actually, and just saying how much I valued her still being here despite everything. So
both you and David went to the same college?
Yes.
In Oxford?
Yes.
Both studied
Yes.
PPE?
Yes.
And what's the gap between you in age?
4.5 years.
And you're the only
Yeah,
two children?
yeah.
And just sort of very quick before I come back to honesty, it seems from the service quite dutiful that you would have thought that you might rebel against this rather kind of earnest political. One of you at least might rebel and go and do something else instead of which. It's a sort of very interesting. It's like
maybe New Labour was the rebellion.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a tribute to my parents, that they were they treated us, this has its downsides, but they treated us as sort of adults when it came to sort of engaging in politics, having views, being an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old. It wasn't like, oh, you're too young to understand that. And maybe today that would be not so out of place, but maybe back then it was sort of different. But
and was David a good older brother?
Yeah, he looked after me, including at school. We went to Haverstock Comprehensive. He looked out for me. Sort of had its rough moments.
Back then?
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll come on to the rough moments later on.
Yeah.
So your first proper job, in quotes, was basically with Harriet Harman. Is that right?
My first proper job was actually working at a television program called A Week in Politics.
Oh, yeah.
And we did an interview with Harriet Harman, which didn't go so well for her. And I sort of got to meet her kind of through that interview. And then she was looking for somebody to come and work for her. And
then Gordon basically poached you.
Yes. We were in the same building in 7 Millbank. And while I was there, actually, I had this sort of moment when I was sort of thinking, do I really want a career in politics? And I went off to do a what's called a mini pupillage, which is to, go and think about being a barrister for a week. And on the 4th day of this mini pupillage, I walked into this. At lunchtime, we went into an Indian restaurant that the people were going to, and there was an Evening Standard on the table, and it said John Smith dead. And it was the day that John Smith had died. And I suddenly said, excuse me, I've got to go. And I never went back.
So you went to
Harriet? I went back to Harriet, and I was like, okay, well, and then obviously the whole leadership thing transpired, but eventually then I went to work for Gordon a few months later.
Right.
So I had dinner with Gordon last week, and I was really struck by the sort of strange kind of craggy charisma of the man and the strange energy of him.
How would you describe it, Alastair?
I'd delete strange. Just the craggy charisma.
I mean, he's a real presence, a kind of great, I was sitting next to him, a great kind of brooding, focused presence with a real views on the world, real vision of the world. What drew you to him? What did you see in this great kind of bear of a man?
Look, I think it was an extraordinary political apprenticeship working for Gordon and Tony. I think the people who were around Gordon and Tony had the most amazing political training. And what did I learn from Gordon? That intellect and ideas really matter in politics. That it isn't just about some superficial headline. You've got to really think the issues through at a very deep, fundamental level. He's a very deep thinker, first of all. Secondly, a sort of sense of political strategy. I don't know anyone who can think sort of 15 moves ahead in the way that he can. And thirdly, his absolute dogged determination. He will do the extra meeting, the extra phone call, oh, it's not possible. There's no point in saying that to Gordon. He's like, well, what do you mean it's not possible? Of course it's possible. Whether that's a local issue that he campaigns on today in Fife or an international, financial architecture issue. And, we might talk about what became known as the TBGBs, but looking back on it, they were like two extraordinary figures to have in a government.
And what was Blair like?
I think somebody said about him, he tripped the light fantastic. He had an extraordinary charisma. Again, an ability to think sort of strategically. Different politics than me, different politics than Gordon.
How different do you think, really? I always thought that was exaggerated a bit.
And we certainly on this podcast, we never hear about any difference. They're presented as the same.
That is not true.
Tell us what the difference is.
The way I think of it is that they were two wings of the aeroplane of the 1997 to 2007, 2010 government.
And tell us to wind up, Alastair, what the difference between the two wings is.
Where was John Prescott?
Gordon was the social justice, child poverty, investment redistribution wing. That's not to say that Tony didn't care about those things. And I think Tony was more the sort of, the public service reform, constitutional reform, Europe wing. But that doesn't say that Gordon didn't care about those things or Tony didn't care about the things that Gordon cared about, but their emphasis was different. I'm trying to put this as sort of fairly and objectively as I can.
Do you think back in 94, though, that we picked the right leader?
Oh, God. Sure. He won 3 elections.
And Gordon, when you talk about Gordon's determination and doggedness, do you think there was ever a time when the TBGBs really did become much more about personalities and ambition? You and I had absolute front row seats of this. We were both members of the so-called Group of Death.
Why was it called that?
I think it was called... Well,
it was after some World Cup.
It was
World
because
Cup thing?
Scotland, Douglas Alexander and I, both Scotland supporters, Scotland always got the Group of Death. We decided to label our meetings the Group of Death. That was you, Douglas, Ed Balls, me and Philip, and occasionally Tony and Gordon. But most of the time, people did work on really well together. And actually, one of the best things is that even though you and I, or me and Ed Balls, would have fallouts, but basically we worked together. But what do you think it was in the end that made the TBGB such a difficult thing to...
Partly personality and partly politics. Look, you're to the left of Tony. No question about it. You were at the time. Fiona certainly is. You were, and you are. We went on this, there was this one famous moment when... Alice knows what I'm going to say. We went on this away day to an advertising agency. What was the advertising agency?
TBWA, I think.
TBWA, and it was it was 2001-ish. And we it was all a sort of, what does the government stand for? And there was one big flaw in this plan, which is everybody went, including Gordon. It was the two teams. It was sort of partly a bonding exercise and partly a where is the government going exercise. The only person who didn't go was Tony. And there was some awkwardness to it. We all had to sort of sit around in a circle and describe our favourite holiday as a child. And Gordon had to do that and all of that. And it was like, oh my God, this is like, I want to crawl under the table here. But we all came out with an incredibly progressive, much more sort of radical view of what the government should stand for. Tony then concluded that the government had been taken over by the Marxists. And that this was the sort of massive project. You remember, this is a fair reading, isn't it?
I think I know.
I think we then had to have a sort of regrouping of this group with Tony involved in it, where we all got sort of wound back and sort of changed and all that.
So what was the slogan? What sort of slogans were you generating? I
don't think it was so much slogan. It was sort of
greater focus on fairness, equality, big mission.
Yeah.
I remember Tony afterwards calling in me and Peter Hyman and saying, Have you lunatics completely taken over the asylum now? And of course, you then became.
I think it was Bob Shrum, the American speechwriter, who somehow got blamed, or Stan Greenberg, who somehow got blamed for this whole thing. But I thought it was really interesting because it took out the people from both sort of camps, if you like, and said, look, what is this government still with a majority of 167 or whatever it was? What is it really in power to do?
And what it revealed is that without Tony Blair in the room, you were all a bunch of lefties.
More lefty, yeah, including him.
That was the meeting where we were all asked to, if we could describe the campaign as a person, who do we choose? And you were like sort of Nelson Mandela. I was Jeff Stelling. And you don't even know who Jeff Stelling is. Jeff Stelling was the Sky Sports commentator. And they all said, who's Jeff Stelling? He said, he's this amazing guy. Data, detail, strategy, big picture.
I mean, listen,
but that is interesting.
Just for a second, my entire experience is he's perpetually mocking me for the fact that I don't know who people like Jeff Stelling is, but he's just revealed that nobody else in the room had any idea who Jeff Stelling was either. So his presentation of himself as being representing 99.9% of humanity who know about this stuff, and I don't. Turns out you don't know this stuff either.
His presentation of himself is always wildly
inaccurate. It's a bit mad. What about, how did you remind our listeners and viewers how you became known as the emissary from Planet Fuck? Do you remember that one?
That's because I was the person who tried to, and look, I think this is sort of what I hope I try and do is sort of try and be somebody who sees different points of view. I mean, I tried to be somebody who helped try and bridge the TBG. Well, you coined the phrase, so I don't know.
Can you explain, though, the language? You were an emissary from which planet?
Planet Fuck.
Yeah. And why was it called, why does the planet have that name?
Well, your memory of this is...
My memory is that Ed was we decided that Ed was the only member of the team who at the time did not tell us to fuck off every time. Every time we met. That made me slightly. But certainly he became known as the emissary from Planet. You didn't mind, though, did you?
No, I thought it was a compliment.
The bridge builder.
It was a compliment.
So after the second election win, you were around with Gordon as a special advisor, but then you went off.
Yeah, there's only so much time you can do these jobs without burning out.
But were you already thinking about becoming an MP?
I wasn't really sure, to be honest, whether I wanted to or not. And I think partly going to Harvard and teaching for a bit and doing other things was, look, do I really want to stick at this?
And what made you answer yes?
It's sort of in my blood. And, I cared about... I remember saying to my dad when I was 18, 19, 20, I can't remember, Dad, I'm not going to be an academic. I don't, it's not really what drives me. What drives me is politics. What drives me is politics. And that wasn't at that point being a politician. And him saying, that's okay. Look, that's obviously fine.
And was he a frustrated politician? Would he have liked to be an MP?
People used to see him speak and say, oh, you should be a Labour politician and so on. I don't think he was. I think he wouldn't have wanted to do it. And look, the Labour Party wasn't the vehicle for him, as he sort of discovered. And being an academic was what drove him, I think.
And in terms, so obviously you can present it as these two very dutiful children, following these very earnest parents into left-wing politics. Yeah. You can also, as Alastair points out, see maybe elements of rebellion. You going more New Labour and him being a Marxist, and potentially also cite rebellion against your brother, who seems more Blairite and you're more Brownite. I mean, did you find that you began to develop a politics that was a little bit different to your brother's, and that was an important part of you becoming an independent human being?
I think I always had a slightly different politics. I mean, look, I don't want to exaggerate the differences between us. I was always more sceptical about New Labour, which maybe in a way this conversation we just had about the away day, the sort of fabled away day, I felt that scepticism. That this was a massive opportunity to change the country. We were a deeply unequal country. Were we doing enough? Were we striving hard enough to make those changes that needed to be made? And that's what I felt throughout the time. And that is, by the way, that's as much about Gordon, because Gordon was obviously the Chancellor, as it is, about Tony. That isn't to say I don't celebrate the great achievements of the government, but I felt there was more we could do.
To give us examples, what are opportunities that, looking back, you think, actually, we might have been able to do that?
We didn't tackle inequality. inequality basically stayed more or less the same. Now, I was very involved in the tax credits thing, which was a massive redistributive thing, which was Gordon's signature policy and lifted kids out of poverty and was an absolutely great thing that we did. But the country remained incredibly unequal. The labour market remained incredibly, in my view, still quite exploitative. I think some of the problems we still see today hark back to some of that.
And what were the policy solutions to those things that could have been pushed ahead between 97 and 2010 that were missed?
I think, look, just for example, a greater role for trade unions. I think we were pretty cautious on labour market reform. Taxation at the top. Taxation at the top was sort of verboten, really, until the end, until after the financial crisis. We did redistribution of the proceeds of growth, which is really, really important, but we shied away from taxing more at the top.
So, Doncaster, you become MP in Doncaster. How did that happen? You got a safe seat. David got a safe seat. Pat McFadden got a safe seat.
And you're not actually from Doncaster, are you?
I'm not, no.
You did spend part of your childhood in Leeds, didn't you?
Yeah. I grew up, became a Leeds United fan, a bit lapsed, very lapsed.
But you also spent part of your life in the States as a child.
I did, definitely. And that's sort of an important part of me.
But when you came back...
I came back in 2004 to Gordon, a bit on sufferance, if I'm honest.
Gordon wanted you back?
Yeah, and I was very thinking, partly just, it's just, the jobs as an advisor, I'm sure my advisors are going to be listening to this and thinking, yeah, too right, mate. But, these jobs are absolutely draining of your life. I mean, it was in the days of landlines, but basically, Justin and I talk about this a lot. I used to have to unplug my phone on a Saturday night because I knew that Gordon would be ringing potentially at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning.
But then he'd ring
and Friday night.
And then when he wouldn't answer, he would
pager.
But then he would ring people that he knew never switched their phone off, such as yours truly, to say, "Have you heard from Ed? Where's Ed? Can't find Ed.
Please call Gordon urgent. Please call Gordon very urgent." I mean, the poor pager people, were sort of on the, it was these pagers that we used to have to communicate. And it's just like, anyway, so I came back.
And then getting a seat was...
Yeah, it was really interesting because, look, what happened was that I was not sure that I wanted what I wanted to do. Gordon was incredibly encouraging, to give him full credit. He was incredibly encouraging to me going for a seat. Rosie Winterton, my dear friend, was the MP in Doncaster Central, said, look, Doncaster North, Kevin Hughes, sadly, the existing MP, had got ill. And I said, well, I'm not from Doncaster, and the deputy mayor of Doncaster is going for the seat. And no way I'm going to get this seat. And she said, well, I think it's more open. I think they might want somebody different, try it. So eventually I did try it. And, I had an extraordinary sort of, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks, going to meet every party member, or as many party members as I could, saying, look, I remember the first conversation I really properly had was the guy who said, look, you're not from here. I don't want you as the MP. And I said, well, look, I'm not from here, but let me explain to you what I think I want to, what I hope I can do as the MP. And, but, after 45 minutes of the conversation, he said, well, okay, I'll meet you. And I thought win or lose that selection. I thought it's been just an amazing experience. And just talking to people about their hopes for the, what had Labour done well, what hadn't it done well, how did the country need to change, all of those things. Anyway, and then I got selected.
One of the things that you then did is you went onto the backbenches for a very, very short period. Tell us, were you really on the backbenches? Were you actually secretly in number 10 all the time and actually in the central government, so you never really experienced what it's like?
No, I was a backbencher.
You're a proper backbencher.
Yeah, and look, there's really sort of important sort of training, and we'll maybe come on to this, but I've been 20 years now as the MP for Doncaster North. Incredibly important to me. It teaches me every day so much about politics, about government, about what we're doing right, what we're not doing right.
Let's look then at so you come in 2005, and I guess one of the themes is that as this remarkable growth happened in Britain from the late 80s into the 90s, there was a big deepening inequality between London and South East and the rest of the country. I mean, I can, we'll get on to what Cameron screwed up, but what do you think in retrospect from 97 to 2010 could have been done to make sure we didn't end up with this enormous regional inequality?
I think sort of saying what could have been done is obviously a complicated question, but I think there's no question that the growth was too unbalanced, too based on sort of financial services, and eventually, obviously, as we saw with the crash, left us too exposed. And look, I think the great thing about the government was that we use, as I said earlier, the proceeds of growth to invest in public services, and they got better in places like Doncaster, significantly better. What we didn't do was change the fundamental sort of insecurity of the economy and the sense of precariousness that people felt. And for a constituency like mine, a former mining constituency, whatever the deep challenges and difficulties of those coal mining jobs, they offered security, a decent pension, a sense of community. And, my sense becoming the MP was those jobs have gone and they've not been replaced. Now, I'm not saying even back then we could go back to lots of coal mining jobs, but that sense of where are the good jobs that offer, and just think about sort of unions, stability, not being about to be fired, not 0 hours contracts, all of those things. And I think that's, that's at the heart of the thing we didn't address. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the heart of it, I think.
Do you, looking at the recent local elections, do you worry for your seat?
Look, I think reform are a threat, yeah. I think reform are a threat across the country. I had this conversation in the pub last Friday night with this guy, and and the conversation went like this. It went through the boats, the NHS, and then it went to, I think, the deepest part of this, which is he said, I feel that we've had governments of different parties, Labour and Tory. Life is so hard for me. How can you answer that question? And I explained how we are trying to answer that question. He said, for me, that's the test. I didn't vote in 2024. I think he voted reform in the local elections. But it was like, I wrote this book where after my period when I lost the election called Go Big. And for me, he epitomized the point of Go Big, which is he was saying, look, whether it's ability to afford a house, make ends meet, the cost of living, the public services, I feel like life is so hard and you guys aren't addressing that.
Back in your sort of rise through the Labour Party, what I'm hearing and what I heard at the time was because I think a lot of people found it difficult to understand how you ended up challenging David for the leadership, because there was this sense that actually, for the public perception,
we challenged each other.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Fair point. There was a conventional wisdom, as there had been with Gordon and Tony before John Smith died. There'd been a conventional wisdom that Gordon was probably going to be the next leader. Tony emerged. There was a conventional wisdom, I think, that David was probably going to be the next leader. And the reason why there might not be a contest, because there was equally a bit of a conventional wisdom that you were very close politically. But actually what you've been saying, what you said to Rory earlier, is that maybe there was a bigger difference between you than even people who knew you well were aware of.
I mean, I don't want to characterize him because that's unfair, but what I felt was we needed a significant moving on from New Labour. I felt I had something distinctive to say in that leadership election. And look, what I always felt was, it's wrong to say that personal ambition isn't an issue for all politicians, but you can't just do this because you want to be leader of the Labour Party. Do you have something distinctive to say about the Labour Party and about the country? And I felt I did have something distinctive to say, and that's why I ran.
And what would David's response to that have been when you said that to him?
Well, I don't know, you had to ask him. What at the time?
Yeah, what would he have said if you'd said that to him? Said, I've got a distinctive vision of the Labour Party. That's why.
Well, we did have that conversation, but obviously, look, it goes without. Well, it's obvious thing to say that the two of us standing against each other, created massive tension and issues. I mean, obviously, it did.
And that's partly about being brothers.
Of course. Well, it is about it.
Yeah.
I
I don't have a brother, so
that's what it is about. I mean, that is absolutely what it's about. And it was a really hard decision. And I totally understand why some people would think they wouldn't have made that decision.
How was your mum with it?
I mean, she did not feel in any way it was her role to say one of you shouldn't stand.
I can remember, I don't know if you remember, my mum came to a fundraiser that I did with you in Doncaster. I remember my mum saying, "Oh, I don't know how you could ever take your brother on like that." That was the kind of, it felt quite Shakespearean, the whole thing. I just wonder what it was like. How did it feel at the centre of it? What was going through your mind as to obviously the political consequences?
It was really hard. Look, it was really hard. And it was really hard for him, and it was going to be really hard for whoever didn't win, which obviously most people thought was going to be me. That wasn't going to win. I actually thought I was going to win, but, it turned out to be right just. But it was it's the hardest decision I've ever made. I felt I owed it to myself to say, look, this is what you believe. This is a distinctive position about the country. These moments don't come along, only really ever come along once. If that's what if you have a distinctive thing to say, you should go out and make your case, and probably, maybe you won't win, and that will be fine. I do think your characterization, though, is interesting. You said you challenged David. Well, we both stood.
Yeah. And I guess what I meant by that is that 6 months before, I wouldn't have seen that coming. I thought, David is probably going to be the next leader. That's what I meant by that.
Yeah.
What's the emotional arc? So you become leader, and I remember that period. I was in Parliament when you became leader, and there, I guess, must have been a moment of sort of, I don't know, tell us about it. Was a moment of anxiety maybe taking over, a moment of optimism when things were going well?
It's an incredibly hard job. It's just an unbelievably hard job. I think it's a particularly hard. Look, it's a hard job all the time. I remember Tony saying to me after I lost, "Well, look, one thing I can say to you is you're never going to do as difficult a job ever again." It's sort of nothing prepares you for it, because it was such a narrow victory. Because lots of people, Alastair included, were so disappointed that David had lost. It made it even harder.
I still helped you.
You did, absolutely, and 100%. No, 100%. And I think that's a really massive credit to you and Gordon. So it's hard. I tried to build bridges because I thought that's the only way this thing can potentially work. Obviously, I hope David would stick around and be in the shadow cabinet. I totally respect that choice he made, which he didn't want to do that, or he wasn't sure. He definitely didn't want to be in at the beginning, and then decided he wanted to leave.
Did you think when you got the job as the leader of the Labour Party, did you think in your heart, did you feel, I am going to win the next election?
Yeah, I thought the election was winnable, definitely. And there were sort of moments of up and moments of down in that period, lots of downs. But I still thought I could win. And in fact, what was sort of quite kind of galling, I think it was different from, say, Hague, is that right up to the last day, including on the day of the election, it looked like the polls were sort of heading in our direction. I remember saying to Justine on the day of the election, I think it looks like we're going to win. Now, I hadn't sort of allowed myself to do lots of sort of measuring the curtains of thinking, oh, we're going to be in Downing Street and so on and so forth, because I didn't sort of partly want to tempt fate. But I thought it was a winnable election.
One thing I was wondering about is that in order partly to motivate yourself, but also in terms of your profound beliefs about the world, you will have strongly felt that David Cameron and George Osborne were taking the country in the wrong direction. Yeah. You probably will have felt that actually they had significant flaws in terms of their analysis, in terms maybe of even who they were as people. And so there was an enormous amount at stake.
Yeah.
Who you were as a person compared to who Cameron was. Where you wanted the country to go compared to where he wanted to go. And of course, you will have felt, quite understandably, you were right about these things intellectually, morally. So that must make the defeat that much more devastating, because in a sense, the British people have chosen that thing which you really don't like at all and which you've been telling them is the wrong path.
Yeah, I'm just on, we do that in two parts. I really thought Cameron's and Osborne's ideas were completely wrong, austerity. One thing I'd say, and this isn't meant to sound sort of politics and clubby, was I always thought to myself, because you said something about personally, I always thought it was quite important not to get into the personal, particularly with David Cameron, sort of personally hating him. I thought Gordon and he had sort of developed this relationship where they sort of really despised each other. And I thought, actually, well, partly because there were some things you needed to cooperate on, but also just because I just thought, I don't know, it sort of clouds your judgment. Do you know what I mean? He was my political opponent. And I still have a sort of slightly odd, I don't really go out lots of the time and criticise him in public. He's obviously not active now in frontline politics. But I don't know, it's sort of a kind of, that's a psychology thing. Don't sort of hate your opponents because it clouds your judgment.
Would you feel differently about Liz Truss and Boris Johnson? Did you find it as easy to think, well, they're all fine, I don't have anything personal against them?
Well, it's not they're all fine because their ideas are horrible. And I really dislike David Cameron's ideas. I just think it's more just a psychology thing.
But it's not that you found Cameron easier to relate to than Boris Johnson.
Not particularly. It's also it's partly you've got to sort of think to yourself, okay, to what extent is this person onto something, and with the public, and how do I respond to that? Like if you just take Johnson. You know, there's lots of things I really hate about Johnson and the way he did his politics. He had an optimism about the country. He tried to express an optimism about the country, and he was good at big narrative, which is worth learning from. You can always learn from your political opponents, is sort of what I think.
Now, Ed, as you know, we had several hundred, possibly even thousands of conversations during your 5 years of leadership. And fair to say, in many of them, I made the same point.
Defend the record.
I made the same point again and
defend
again
the
and again and again. Correct.
Go on, Alastair. Give us your defend the record.
No. Give us that analysis, Alice. It's worth hearing.
My analysis was that I thought Ed had a lot of qualities and a lot of good ideas, and there was a really clear sense of what he wanted to do. But I felt that given that the Tories were trashing our record, the media were trashing our record, if the Labour Party wasn't defending our record, that would ultimately become a disadvantage to Ed when he went into the election. And I still believe that. And Ed always said, I don't have the bandwidth in terms of how much people are going to listen to me. If I get bang on about the past, bang on about your record, then I'm essentially wasting my time. I mean, I'm paraphrasing a very long conversation.
So my response to this, Rory, you can be the adjudicator. My response to this is I'm really proud of lots of the things the Labour government did. But I think when the public throws you out, if the next person who comes along tries to defend the people that got thrown, sort of in the generality, in the limited bandwidth you get heard by the public, to say, oh, well, actually, you threw us out, but actually we were really good, you don't have a chance of winning. And that somehow, however good the government was, implicit in this, or explicit, as a matter of strategy, is you have to show you're moving on from the past.
So you thought actually maybe that Alastair was just too attached to the achievements of New Labour, and actually if he'd been thinking more clearly as a strategic communications person, he would have realised that if he put himself aside, it wasn't smart politics.
If you want to put it that way, Rory, then.
I think you're both being very unfair and limited in your discussion.
Let me put it the other way around, because, I mean, Alastair, obviously, this is a kind of big theme with him. So he would also say that if we look today, he's very troubled by some of the language around immigration. And one of the arguments he'd make there is that you're basically playing to your opponent's strengths. You're reinforcing their narrative. And that's part of the, presumably you would say that's part of the risk of what he was doing, is that he was actually...
I think the point I made, if Cameron is basically saying, don't go back to Labour, what was their line? Don't give the keys back to the people who crashed the car.
Yeah.
If we're sort of accepting the narrative that actually we did kind of crash the car, that's a big problem. And I think it's one of the reasons that...
No, Alastair, but the way I think about this is so interesting, is that the big problem was that the global financial crisis happened on our watch. Now, I don't think it's fair to say that it was the Labour government that was responsible for that, but the truth is that when those kind of things happen, with all the implications it has, and, you know, we were part of a more sort of deregulatory position, and okay, Cameron was calling for even more deregulation, or blah, blah, blah. people are going to hold you responsible.
Yeah, but Ed, this play, you saying earlier that you wanted to take the party to the left. Part of the argument I think you could have made is actually that, Gordon's role in bailing out the crisis, and the crisis having been caused by greedy right-wing bastards in America that you two, Osborne and Cameron, identify with way more than we do.
That's not defending the record position. That's a whole different strategic. That's a whole different
it's
strategic
part of the
argument.
Same political strategy that I wanted you.
It's a slightly. In a way, you've shown. Look, maybe that would have been a better strategy, but that isn't a defending the record strategy. But look, I'm not saying. God knows I did lots and lots of things wrong as leader. My view, and maybe it just speaks to what Alastair said, is that I wasn't bold enough and clear enough about my agenda for the country. That's kind of what took me to the book, and that in a way I was too hemmed. I actually felt, contrary to Alastair, I was too hemmed in by the past. I was too trying to build a bridge to like what Labour had done. I wasn't just clear enough about saying the past is the past. This is my vision.
So is that possibly something about you that actually you maybe concluded that you were never going to be able to be just a sort of jolly Boris Johnson optimist, nor were you going to be able to be a kind of smooth Cameron centrist, that actually you needed to lean into your more intellectual side, your more radical side, and be yourself more?
I think the more radical side, yes. Look at what happened subsequently. You had Brexit in 2016. You had Corbyn's unexpected coming close in the election of 2017, losing.
How much more percent of the vote did he get than you?
Quite a lot more.
He took it from sort of 30-something% up to 40-something percent.
Yeah, exactly.
Massive jump.
You had sort of Johnson in 2019. And look, this is in a way, if there's one big thing that should come out of this discussion on sort of substantively, it's that these things should tell us something, which is that so many people in our country and the rise of reform are deeply unhappy with the way this country is run and has been run for a very long time. And they feel it is not serving them well. They are struggling. They are working harder for longer for less. I think there's a phrase that Clinton originally used. And they are saying the system is not working for us. And that is in a way the big exam question of British politics. And I think, to answer your question directly, Rory, I think I knew in the back of my mind, I knew in the front of my mind that was the exam question, because that was a lot of what my analysis was. But I felt this as a leader, and I would say this to my team, does the prescription add up to an answer to that big analysis of the state of the country?
Well, Ed, thank you for setting the exam question. We'll try and maybe get you to answer it in part 2, where we're going to talk about recovering from election defeat, why you decided to stay in politics, and some of the big challenges you've got now in your current job. If you can't wait to hear that episode, it is available right now to Trip Plus members. Just go to therestipolitics.com to sign up. You'll get that episode as well as ad-free listening, bonus episodes with deep dives on policy, as well as a member-only newsletter with book discounts and more. If not, we'll see you with Ed Miliband next week. Goodbye.
Looking forward to it.
See you soon.